Have you ever smiled at someone while secretly knowing their entire plan was about to collapse? Imagine turning 18 years old and discovering that the people you trusted most were already deciding how to spend money that wasn't theirs. Imagine sitting at your own birthday party while your father and uncle discussed selling a property they believed they would soon control. Now imagine that before they could make a single move, you quietly placed an invisible legal wall around everything they wanted. That is exactly what happened to me. My name is Iris Tamain, and the morning after my 18th birthday, my father learned that the cabin he planned to sell, the investment accounts he expected to access, and every dollar my grandparents left behind were completely beyond his reach. But to understand how everything reached that point, you need to go back several years, to a quiet lakeside cabin where my grandfather taught me lessons that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with trust. The summer I turned 12, my grandfather Harold began taking me to Cedar Lake almost every weekend. The drive took about 40 minutes, winding through narrow roads lined with pine trees and old farm fields. Every time we crossed the final hill and the lake came into view, Grandpa smiled as if he were seeing it for the first time. The cabin sat near the water, surrounded by towering white pines that seemed to guard it from the outside world. It wasn't luxurious. The porch leaned slightly to one side. The paint was fading. The screen door rattled whenever the wind blew. But to me, it felt more like home than any other place I knew. One Saturday morning, Grandpa handed me the end of a weathered fence rail. "Grab that side, Iris." I did. Together we replaced old fence posts that had begun to rot. He showed me how to inspect wood carefully instead of assuming it was strong. "If your thumb sinks in," he told me, pressing against a damaged section, "the inside is already gone." At 12 years old I thought he was teaching me about fences. Years later, I realized he was teaching me about people. When we finished working, we headed inside where Grandma Vivian had already prepared lunch. 2 sandwiches sat on the kitchen table beside tall glasses of iced tea. The table itself had been built by Grandpa decades earlier, shortly after he married Grandma. Every mark in the wood told a story. Every scratch had a memory attached to it. Grandma always seemed to know exactly what I wanted before I asked. She would smile when I walked through the door, and somehow already have my favorite meal waiting. That afternoon, after lunch, we sat together on the porch overlooking the lake. The sunlight reflected off the water like liquid gold. Grandpa leaned back in his chair and watched the horizon quietly. Then he said something I didn't fully understand at the time. "This cabin stays in the family." I smiled. "Of course it does." He shook his head gently. "Family isn't always blood, Iris. Family is whoever shows up when it matters." At 12 years old, I thought he was speaking poetically. I had no idea he was speaking literally. Throughout that summer, I learned every corner of the property. Grandpa showed me where the water heater occasionally leaked. He taught me how to identify weak spots in the roof before they became serious problems. He showed me old property markers buried in the ground near the edge of the woods. I listened because I loved spending time with him. I never questioned why he wanted me to know these things. Back home, life felt very different. Our house in Ridgemont wasn't terrible. It was comfortable enough, but it lacked the warmth that filled every room of the cabin. My younger sister Kelsey was the center of attention most of the time. She had the larger bedroom. New furniture appeared whenever she wanted it. Every achievement she earned became a family celebration. I didn't resent her. None of it was her fault, but I noticed the difference. One evening during dinner, my father Greg brought up Cedar Lake. He cut into his steak before speaking. "That property is losing money every year." Grandpa looked up. "What property?" "The cabin." Dad shrugged. "Property taxes keep increasing. Maintenance cost needs to be realistic." The room grew quiet. I looked toward Grandpa. His expression never changed. Dad continued. "We should sell it someday and invest the money properly." Grandma set down her fork. "The cabin isn't for sale." Dad laughed lightly, not a cruel laugh, something worse, the kind that dismisses an opinion without directly challenging it. "We'll see." The conversation moved on. Nobody argued, but I noticed Grandpa Sel staring out the window afterward. Later that night, while helping clear dishes, I noticed a glossy brochure partially hidden beneath a grocery list. The front showed luxury lakefront homes. The headline advertised premium development opportunities. A handwritten phone number appeared in one corner. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but I knew exactly which property they were talking about. The cabin. I carefully returned the brochure to its original position and went upstairs. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the difference between how my grandparents saw the cabin and how my father saw it. To Grandpa, it was memories. To Dad, it was real estate. At 12 years old, I couldn't fully explain why that bothered me. I only knew it felt wrong. The following summer looked much the same. More repairs, more lessons, more weekends at Cedar Lake. Sometimes Grandpa would teach me practical skills. Other times, we would simply sit on the dock and watch the water. Those moments became some of the happiest memories of my childhood. What I didn't know was that while we were repairing fences and cleaning gutters, Grandpa was quietly making legal arrangements. He had already started planning for a future problem that nobody else could see. A future problem with my father and my uncle Wade. At the time, Wade visited occasionally. He worked in real estate and always seemed to have a new investment opportunity. Every conversation somehow returned to money, property values, market trends, future profits. Whenever he visited the cabin, he spent more time looking at the land than enjoying it. Grandpa noticed, so did Grandma. Neither of them said much, but they noticed. Years later, I would realize they noticed everything. And while the rest of the family focused on what the cabin was worth, my grandparents were quietly deciding who they trusted to protect it. That decision would eventually change all of our lives. I just didn't know it yet. Because at 12 years old, all I cared about was spending another summer beside Cedar Lake with the 2 people who made me feel loved. I never imagined those peaceful weekends were actually preparing me for the biggest battle of my life. 2 years after that summer, everything changed. I was 14 years old when my grandfather Harold passed away. The call came early in the morning. I remember the silence that filled our house afterward. Not the normal kind of silence. The heavy kind that settles into walls, furniture, and follows people from room to room. For the first time in my life, I couldn't imagine Cedar Lake without him standing on the porch waiting for me. The funeral took place beneath a gray sky that threatened rain all day. Folding chairs were arranged across the damp grass, and relatives I barely knew appeared from different states to pay their respects. Everyone spoke softly. Everyone shared stories. Everyone talked about what a good man Harold Tremaine had been. I sat in the second row, holding one of Grandpa's handkerchiefs. It was blue plaid, worn smooth from years of use. I kept it clenched in my hand through the entire service, because it still carried a faint scent of pine and sawdust. It felt like the last physical piece of him I had left. After the burial, everyone gathered at the church reception hall. People lined up for coffee and desserts while conversations drifted from memories to future plans. I wasn't paying much attention until I noticed my father Greg standing near the dessert table with my uncle Wade. Both men were speaking quietly. Too quietly. Wade held a thick folder under his arm. Their faces didn't look sad. They looked focused. As I walked past, I caught a single sentence. "We should move before probate gets complicated." The words froze me in place. Grandpa had been gone less than 3 hours. Yet somehow they were already discussing paperwork. Already discussing legal matters. Already discussing property. I didn't understand everything then. But I understood enough to know they weren't talking about memories. They were talking about assets. That night, after everyone returned home, I sat alone in my bedroom staring at the ceiling. The grief hurt, but something else bothered me too. Something I couldn't quite name. For the first time, I wondered whether my father and uncle loved the cabin for the same reasons I did. Deep down, I already knew the answer. The next 2 years passed quickly. I continued visiting Cedar Lake whenever possible. Grandma Vivian still lived there most of the year, and every visit felt like stepping back into safety. She never allowed Grandpa's absence to turn the cabin into a monument to sadness. Instead, she filled it with life. She baked, she gardened, she organized bookshelves, she told stories, and somehow she made sure the place still felt alive. But time wasn't kind to her. When I turned 16, she became sick. At first it seemed manageable. A few doctor appointments, some medication, a little less energy. Then suddenly everything accelerated. Within months, she looked older than I had ever seen her. The woman who once carried firewood across the yard without assistance, now struggled to walk from the living room to the kitchen. One afternoon in early June, I sat beside her hospital bed. The sunlight streamed through the blinds in thin golden lines. Machines hummed quietly nearby. Her hand felt smaller than I remembered, but her grip was still strong. Much stronger than her appearance suggested. She squeezed my fingers and looked directly into my eyes. "The cabin is yours, Iris." My throat tightened. I tried to answer. Nothing came out. She squeezed my hand again. "Don't let them take it." A tear rolled down my cheek. "I promise, Grandma." For a moment she smiled. A real smile. The same smile she had worn while serving sandwiches at the cabin kitchen table. Then she closed her eyes and rested. Those became the last meaningful words she ever spoke to me. A few weeks later, she was gone. The second funeral felt different from the first. With Grandpa gone, there was no comforting presence left to anchor the family. Something had shifted. Something important. And everyone seemed to feel it. After the service, relatives gathered again. More coffee, more condolences, more polite conversations. But this time I paid closer attention, and what I heard disturbed me. That evening, after we returned home, my father sat at the kitchen table with a relieved expression. Not devastated, not heartbroken, relieved. "Now we can finally sort out the property," he told my mother. The word struck me like a slap. His mother had been gone less than a day, yet he was already discussing ownership. Already discussing the cabin. Already discussing what came next. Later that night, I heard him speaking on the phone in the garage. I couldn't hear every word, only fragments, but I heard enough. "Yeah, pause. I agree." Another pause. "We should move quickly." Then more silence. I didn't need to hear the other voice to know it was Wade. From that moment forward, something changed inside me. Not anger, not revenge. Determination, because for the first time, I realized my grandparents and my parents weren't fighting over the same thing. My grandparents loved the cabin. My parents loved its value. And those are not the same thing. Over the next year, Cedar Lake became my escape. Every Saturday morning, I drove there in a used Honda I had purchased through part-time jobs and babysitting money. I repaired loose screens. I cleaned gutters. I swept pine needles from the roof. I checked weather stripping around windows. Every repair felt like keeping a promise. A promise I had made beside a hospital bed. Back home, the language started changing. The cabin was no longer called Grandpa's place, or Grandma's place. Now it was called family property. The phrase appeared constantly, at dinner, during phone calls, during visits from Wade. Family property. The more they used those words, the more uneasy I became. One afternoon, while cleaning a hallway closet inside the cabin, I made a discovery. Behind a stack of folded quilts sat a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Grandma Vivian's handwriting. My heart started racing. I carefully opened it. Inside was a single business card, nothing else, no letter, no explanation. Just a card: Margaret Caldwell, attorney at law. Below her name were 4 words: Tremaine Family Trust. I stared at the card for several minutes. Grandma hadn't hidden this by accident. She had left it for me, specifically for me, not for Greg, not for Wade. Me. I slipped the card into my wallet and drove home. For weeks, I debated whether to call. Part of me worried I was overthinking everything. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was simply old paperwork. Maybe I was imagining connections that didn't exist. Then something unexpected happened. Margaret Caldwell called me first. It was a Thursday evening in February. I was sitting at my desk working on calculus homework when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar local number. I answered. "Hello," a calm professional voice responded immediately. "Is this Iris Tremaine?" "Yes. My name is Margaret Caldwell. I was your grandparents' attorney." Every nerve in my body became alert. There was a brief pause. Then she said something that would change my life. "We need to meet before your 18th birthday." The following Saturday, I walked into Margaret's office downtown. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Shelves lined the walls. Files were organized with almost military precision. Margaret looked exactly how I imagined an experienced attorney would look. Silver hair, sharp eyes, and the confidence of someone who rarely wasted words. She opened a folder, then she delivered a sentence I will never forget. "Your grandparents established an irrevocable trust 6 years ago." I stared at her. She continued. "The Cedar Lake cabin, multiple investment accounts, and a savings portfolio were transferred into that trust." I struggled to process the information. How much? Margaret glanced at the paperwork. Current estimated value is approximately $2.1 million. The room felt suddenly smaller. My grandparents had planned all of this years ago. Every detail, every contingency, every possible challenge. Then Margaret looked directly at me. You are the sole beneficiary. And in that moment, I finally understood why Grandma left me the card. I also understood something else. The battle my father and uncle thought they were preparing to win had already been decided years before they even knew it existed. For several minutes after Margaret revealed the truth, I couldn't speak. The number alone felt unreal. $2.1 million. The cabin, the savings, the investments, everything my grandparents had spent a lifetime building, had already been protected years earlier, through a legal structure that couldn't simply be overturned by relatives who felt entitled to it. Margaret gave me time to absorb the information before continuing. Your grandparents were very specific, she said, sliding several documents across her desk. They didn't want these assets passing through probate. They wanted them protected from exactly the kind of dispute they believed would happen after they were gone. I looked down at the paperwork. The trust had been established 6 years earlier. Long before Grandpa died. Long before Grandma became sick. Long before anyone else thought there was a problem. They had seen the storm coming years before it arrived. What made them think this would happen? I asked quietly. Margaret removed her glasses and folded her hands. Your grandfather gave me very direct instructions. She paused, then repeated his exact words. My sons will try to sell that cabin before the funeral flowers are gone. A chill moved through me, because deep down, I knew he had been right. Margaret reached for another folder. There's something else you should know. Her tone became more serious. Over the last month, someone has been making inquiries about the Cedar Lake property through the county recorder's office. My stomach tightened. What kind of inquiries? Ownership records, transfer history, title information. I already knew the answer before she said it. Wade? Margaret nodded slowly. I can't prove it, but I would be very surprised if it were anyone else. When I left her office that afternoon, I wasn't the same person who had walked in. For the first time, I understood that my grandparents hadn't simply left me an inheritance. They had left me a responsibility. And somewhere in town, people were already making plans for property they didn't own. Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention to everything happening around me. Not obviously, not suspiciously, just quietly. I listened more than I spoke, and eventually, my patience paid off. One Sunday evening, Wade came over for dinner. After the meal ended, he and my father disappeared into the garage. Normally I wouldn't have cared. But now every conversation involving the cabin mattered. As I carried dishes toward the kitchen sink, I noticed the garage door wasn't fully closed. A narrow gap remained open, just enough for sound to escape. I stopped. Not close enough to be seen, close enough to hear. Wade spoke first. I already signed the agreement. My pulse immediately accelerated. Dad answered. You signed it already? Of course I did. There was confidence in Wade's voice. The confidence of a man who believed he controlled the situation. The buyer wants the property. $450,000. We just need title cleared before closing. My hands became cold. $450,000. He had already agreed to sell the cabin, without owning it, without controlling it, without even verifying whether he had legal authority. My father sounded uneasy. How do we clear the title? Wade answered immediately. Simple, quitclaim deed. There was a short silence, then Dad asked the question that mattered most. What about Iris? I held my breath. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Wade laughed softly. She's 17. His answer came so quickly it sounded rehearsed. She can't do anything. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were insulting, because they revealed exactly how little they thought of me. Wade continued. By the time she's 18, the sale will already be moving. Worst case, we give her a share. What kind of share? 50,000. I nearly laughed out loud. The cabin alone was worth hundreds of thousands. The trust was worth millions. And Wade thought $50,000 would make everything disappear. She'll be grateful, he said. Those words told me everything I needed to know. I stepped away from the garage before either of them could notice me. My heart pounded all the way upstairs. Once inside my room, I locked the door and sent a text to Margaret. 2 simple words. They're accelerating. Her reply arrived less than 5 minutes later. I expected that, then another message followed. Come see me Saturday. When Saturday arrived, Margaret already had a plan prepared. Legal documents covered most of her desk. Timelines, property records, trust paperwork. Everything was organized with incredible precision. She explained that the cabin title had already been held by the trust for years. If Wade attempted to transfer ownership, the county records would immediately expose the problem. But there was still risk. A determined person could create delays, fraudulent filings, claims, legal complications, not ownership, but headaches, which meant timing mattered, more than ever. The moment you turn 18, Margaret explained, you can formally accept your position as beneficiary. I nodded, and then I file public notice of your legal interest before anyone else can create problems. The strategy was simple, but it required patience. The hardest kind of patience, the kind where you know what's happening, and still stay silent. Back at home, the pressure started increasing. My parents suddenly became very interested in discussing family finances. Every conversation somehow returned to the cabin. Every discussion eventually became about sacrifice. One evening, my mother sat beside me on the couch. Her expression was carefully controlled. The same expression people wear when they've rehearsed a conversation beforehand. We should talk like adults. I knew immediately where this was heading. The cabin costs money, she began. Taxes, repairs, insurance. I remained silent. She continued. Your father's business is struggling. That part wasn't a secret. The building supply store had been losing money for months. But if we sell the cabin, she said, everyone benefits. Everyone, not grandma, not grandpa, not me, everyone. I looked at her. Grandma wanted me to keep it. For a split second, annoyance crossed her face, then it disappeared. She was emotional near the end. The statement angered me more than I expected, because it wasn't true. Grandma had known exactly what she was doing. My mother simply didn't like the answer. A few days later, Wade approached me directly. I was unloading groceries from my car when he appeared in the driveway, smiling, relaxed, friendly, like a salesman approaching a customer, which, in a way, he was. Got a minute, kiddo? I already knew what was coming. Still, I nodded. We sat on the front steps. He leaned forward confidently. The land alone is worth a fortune. I said nothing. We can close quickly. Still nothing. Then he finally reached the number. $50,000 cash. The same amount from the garage conversation. The same amount he thought would buy my cooperation. I looked directly at him. And what do you get? His smile widened. Everybody wins.
That wasn't an answer, Chef.
Which meant it was the real answer. I asked another question. Whose name is on the deed? For the first time his confidence cracked. Only slightly, but I noticed. Your grandparents. Then he quickly added, but that's temporary, we're the heirs. I already knew he was wrong. And somehow, knowing the truth made his confidence seem smaller. When he finally left, I watched him drive away while talking on his phone, probably calling Dad, probably discussing me, probably wondering why I wasn't cooperating. The night before my 18th birthday, I drove to Cedar Lake alone. The road was quiet, the lake reflected moonlight like polished glass. Everything felt still, peaceful, permanent. I sat on the porch beside Grandpa's old chair, and opened the email Margaret had sent earlier that day. The documents were ready. The trust acceptance forms, the beneficiary confirmations, every signature page marked and prepared, all waiting for midnight. For nearly an hour I sat listening to the wind move through the pines, thinking about Grandpa, thinking about Grandma, thinking about promises. At exactly midnight, I opened my laptop. Margaret appeared on a video call. Her office lamp illuminated stacks of paperwork behind her. Happy birthday, Iris. I smiled. Thank you. Then she slid into professional mode. Ready? I nodded. And together we began signing the documents that would change everything. At 12 years old, I learned how to repair a fence. At 18 years old, I learned how to protect an inheritance. And somewhere across town, my uncle was preparing paperwork for a property he was about to discover he never owned. Neither of us slept much that night, but only one of us woke up as the legal beneficiary of the Temain family trust. The morning after my 18th birthday began more quietly than I expected. After months of tension, planning, and waiting, I woke up feeling strangely calm. The documents had already been signed. The trust had already been accepted. The hardest part was over. At least, that's what I thought. At exactly 8 o'clock that morning, Margaret Caldwell walked into the county recorder's office, carrying a leather folder filled with documents that had been prepared years before I ever knew they existed. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't nervous. She simply looked like a professional doing her job, because that's exactly what she was doing. The clerk at the counter reviewed the paperwork carefully. A certified copy of the Temain Family Irrevocable Trust, proof of beneficiary designation and, most importantly, a legal notice publicly establishing an active interest in the Cedar Lake property. Within minutes, the documents were stamped, recorded, and entered into the system. The protection my grandparents had built years earlier was now fully active. Anyone searching the property records would immediately see the truth. The cabin belonged to the trust. Not my father, not my uncle, not anyone else. At 8:14 a.m., my phone rang. It was Margaret. It's done. Just 2 words, yet hearing them felt like a mountain being lifted off my shoulders. The filing has been recorded, she continued. The title is protected. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. Meanwhile, life inside our house looked completely normal. My mother was making coffee. The television was playing quietly in the background. My father was upstairs getting dressed. Nobody except me knew their entire plan had already collapsed. At 8:30, Greg and Wade came downstairs together. Wade carried the same folder I had seen dozens of times before. The folder that supposedly contained their future. The folder that was about to become worthless. We'll be back around lunch, Dad announced. I looked up from the kitchen table. Good luck. The words escaped before I could stop them. Dad paused briefly. Something about my tone seemed to catch his attention. But only for a second. Then both men walked out the door and drove straight toward disaster. Later, I learned exactly what happened when they arrived. The county recorder's office was already busy when Wade approached the counter. He carried himself with complete confidence. The confidence of a man who believed he was moments away from securing nearly $500,000. He slid the quitclaim deed across the desks. The clerk entered the parcel number, typed for several seconds, then stopped. She looked at the screen, typed again, looked again, and finally shook her head. I'm sorry, sir, I can't record this. Wade blinked. What do you mean you can't record it? The clerk turned her monitor slightly. The property is owned by the Temain Family Irrevocable Trust. According to Margaret, the color drained from his face almost immediately. Dad stepped closer. There must be a mistake. The clerk checked again. There isn't. She pointed toward the record. The trust was recorded 6 years ago. 6 years. The same 6 years during which my uncle never bothered checking ownership before attempting to sell the property. The same 6 years during which my grandparents quietly protected everything. Wade's confidence evaporated. That's impossible. No, sir, the clerk replied. It's documented. Dad looked at him slowly, carefully. You checked the title, right? The silence that followed answered the question. For the first time, Dad realized Wade had never verified anything. He had simply assumed. Assumed ownership, assumed inheritance, assumed success. And now those assumptions were collapsing in public. The clerk continued speaking. There's also a legal notice recorded this morning. She pointed toward another entry. Active beneficiary interest. The room suddenly became much smaller, because now there was a name attached to the trust. A name they both recognized. Iris Temain. According to Margaret, neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Dad turned toward Wade. You said this was simple. Wade had no answer, because there wasn't one. The truth was simple. The cabin had never been theirs, and no amount of paperwork could change that. At 9:22 a.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Dad. The second I answered, I heard anger trot anger. What did you do? I looked out the window calmly, accepted what Grandma and Grandpa left me. The line went silent, then his voice returned lower this time. You went behind our backs. No, I answered honestly. They went behind yours. Another long silence followed. Then came the sentence I had expected for months. This is my parents' property. I closed my eyes. No, Dad. My voice stayed steady. It was their property, and they decided what would happen to it. The silence that followed felt endless. Eventually he hung up. No goodbye, no explanation, just anger. That afternoon, my birthday party continued exactly as planned. Balloons filled the living room. Relatives and neighbors filled the house. The smell of cake and food drifted through every room. To everyone else, it looked like a normal family celebration. But underneath the smiles a storm was already forming. I greeted guests, opened presents, posed for photos, and waited. Because I knew what was coming. Eventually Dad stood near the cake table and tapped his glass. The room grew quiet. He smiled broadly, the same public smile he always used during community events. I just want to say how proud we are of Iris. People applauded. He continued. And now that she's officially an adult, our family is looking forward to some exciting plans. My stomach tightened. Here it comes. Dad glanced toward me, then toward the guests, and finally spoke the sentence he had been waiting months to say. We've decided to sell the cabin. The room reacted immediately. Several people nodded. A few smiled. Others simply surprised. Dad wasn't finished. The proceeds will help secure our future. Family. There was that word again. Always family when money was involved. Never family when promises mattered. Then he looked directly at me. Right, sweetheart? Every eye in the room turned toward me. The silence became almost physical. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even reached for their food. I carefully placed my fork on my plate. The sound seemed louder than it should have. Then I stood and answered. Never agreed to sell the cabin. The room froze. Dad's smile remained in place, but only on the surface. Underneath I could see panic beginning to form. She's joking, he said quickly. No, I looked directly at him. I'm not. Across the room Wade shifted uncomfortably. He already knew the truth. He already knew their plan had failed. Now he was terrified everyone else might learn it too. He stepped forward. This isn't the place for this conversation. I nodded. For once, I actually agreed with him. You're right, Uncle Wade. The room grew even quieter. I held his gaze. The place for this conversation was the county recorder's office this morning. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Others frowned. Nobody understood what that sentence meant. Not yet, but Wade did. Dad did too. And the expressions on their faces told the entire story. The party never recovered after that. People stayed another hour, maybe, 2, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations became awkward. Laughter became forced. Guests left earlier than planned. Everyone sensed something serious had happened. Nobody knew exactly what, but they knew enough to leave. By evening, only family remained inside the house. And for the first time all day, there was nowhere left for anyone to hide. The real confrontation was about to begin. The front door closed behind the last guest, and for the first time all evening, the house became completely silent. The cheerful birthday atmosphere disappeared instantly. The balloons were still hanging from the ceiling. Half-finished slices of cake remained on paper plates. Wrapping paper sat scattered across the living room floor. Yet somehow the house felt colder than it had a few minutes earlier. My mother was the first to speak. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath every word. Do you have any idea what you've done today? I looked at her calmly. I told the truth. The truth, she snapped. You humiliated your father in front of everyone. Before I could answer, Nora Beckett, our longtime neighbor from Cedar Lake who had stayed behind, stepped forward. No, Denise, she said firmly. The truth humiliated him. The room immediately became tense. My mother turned toward her. This is a family matter. Nora didn't move. So was the cabin. The silence that followed could have shattered glass. Eventually Nora placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and gave me a reassuring look before leaving. The moment the door closed behind her, the situation exploded. Dad pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table. The expression on his face was unlike anything I had ever seen before. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't raging. He looked defeated, but he still wasn't ready to let go. Here's what's going to happen, he said quietly. I already knew I wasn't going to like the rest. Tomorrow, we figure this out. It's already figured out. His jaw tightened. No, it isn't. Wade stepped forward. His confidence was gone now. In its place was desperation. We can still work something out. I folded my arms. What exactly are you offering? 50,000. The same number again, the same insult disguised as generosity. The same attempt to buy something they didn't own. I almost laughed. Then Dad said something that hurt far more than any financial offer. If you don't cooperate, you're on your own. The room became completely still. No college help. He looked directly at me. No support. Then came the final sentence. If you want to fight your family, don't expect to keep living under this roof. For a moment nobody moved. Even Wade looked uncomfortable. My little sister Kelsey sat halfway up the staircase, staring at everyone with wide eyes. I slowly stood from the table. You're threatening to throw me out because I won't give you Grandma's cabin. Dad didn't answer, because there was no better way to say it. I went upstairs without another word. Inside my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window. The house felt different now. Not because of the argument, because the masks were finally gone. Everyone was showing exactly who they were. The next morning, the consequences arrived faster than anyone expected. At 10 a.m., my uncle received a phone call from Ridgeline Development. The company had discovered the truth. The purchase agreement Wade signed was worthless, because he never owned the property. The deal was dead. The penalty clause was not. $45,000. Immediately due. When Wade called my father afterward, his voice was shaking. They're suing me. Dad's response surprised even me. Did you check the title before signing? A long silence followed. Finally Wade admitted the truth. No. The word hung in the air. One tiny word that had created a disaster. The situation became even worse a few days later. Margaret obtained a copy of the rejected quitclaim filing. While reviewing it, she discovered something alarming. The notary stamp attached to the document wasn't legitimate. It didn't belong to any registered notary in the county. The stamp was fake, which meant the document wasn't merely invalid. It was potentially criminal. When Margaret told me, I sat in silence for nearly a minute. My uncle hadn't simply tried to sell property he didn't own. He had attempted to support the transaction using fraudulent documentation. The county eventually referred the matter for investigation. Word spread quickly. Small towns have a way of learning everything. Nobody needed social media. Nobody needed newspapers. People talked at grocery stores, church parking lots, coffee shops, hardware stores, everywhere. The story became local gossip almost overnight. Harold Tremaine's sons tried selling a cabin that belonged to their niece. That was the version most people heard. And honestly, it wasn't wrong. Over the next several weeks the fallout continued. Ridgeline filed a civil lawsuit. The financial penalties grew. Legal fees accumulated. Wade's real estate license was suspended during the investigation. The man who built his career around property transactions suddenly couldn't legally participate in them. Dad faced problems of his own. The building supply business finally collapsed. The debts couldn't be ignored anymore. Without the imaginary cabin money he had counted on, reality arrived quickly. He sold the store, negotiated repayment plans, and spent months trying to save the family home. For almost 2 weeks, we barely spoke. The silence inside the house felt heavier than any argument. Then one evening, my phone rang. It was Kelsey. Her voice sounded small, uncertain. Nora told me some of what happened. I stayed quiet. Then she asked a question that broke my heart. Was I part of the problem? I closed my eyes, because she genuinely believed she might have been. No. The answer came immediately. Never. She hadn't asked to be favored. She hadn't asked for special treatment. She was just a kid, just like I had been. A few weeks later, I drove back to Cedar Lake. For the first time since everything happened, I was completely alone. The cabin stood exactly where it always had. The porch still leaned slightly. The screen door still rattled. The smell of pine and old wood still filled every room. Some things hadn't changed at all. Inside the desk drawer near the window, I found something Margaret had mentioned earlier. A letter, written by Grandpa, addressed to me. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The letter wasn't long, but every word mattered. He explained why he created the trust, why he protected the cabin, why he chose me. One sentence stayed with me more than any other. You always asked what the cabin needed before you asked what it was worth. I read that line 3 times, then a fourth, because in one sentence, Grandpa had explained everything. The entire conflict, the entire inheritance, the entire reason he trusted me. To him, value and worth were different things. Most people spend their lives confusing them. The cabin had financial value, but its real worth couldn't be measured on paper. Weeks later, Margaret called again with good news. The immediate legal threat was over. The title was secure, the trust remained protected. And there was one final surprise. Your grandparents established a separate education fund. The account contained just over $58,000. I laughed through tears. $58,000. Almost the exact amount Wade had offered as a bribe. Except this money came from love, not manipulations. Months later, I enrolled in college and officially moved into the cabin. For the first time, I wrote the Cedar Lake address on official paperwork. For the first time, it wasn't a place I visited, it was home. Eventually, I met my parents at a coffee shop. Neutral territory, no lawyers, no arguments, just conversation. I told them something important. I love you. Both of them looked surprised. Then I continued. But the cabin isn't for sale. Dad stared into his cafe, Mom looked away, and for the first time, nobody argued, nobody negotiated. Nobody made threats. The truth had finally become unavoidable. Before leaving, Dad said something quietly. I don't know how to fix this. I nodded. You don't have to fix it today. That was the beginning, not a perfect ending, not forgiveness overnight. Just a beginning. A few weeks later, Kelsey arrived at the cabin carrying a pizza box. We spent the afternoon sitting on the porch overlooking the lake. We talked about school, movies, life, everything except lawsuits and inheritance. At one point she looked across the water and smiled. It's beautiful here. I smiled too. Grandma used to say that every single time. The lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. For the first time in months, everything felt peaceful. Not because I had won. Because nobody truly wins when family breaks apart. What I gained wasn't victory. It was clarity. Years earlier, my grandparents saw a storm coming. They couldn't stop it. They couldn't control the choices other people would make. But they could leave me shelter. They could leave me protection. They could leave me a foundation strong enough to stand on when everything else started shaking. As I sat on that porch watching the sun sink toward the horizon, I thought about Grandpa's final lesson. The difference between something that has value and something that's valuable. My father saw numbers, my uncle saw profit, my grandparents saw memories. And because they did, Cedar Lake was still standing. The cabin wasn't special because of what it could be sold for. It was special because of what it represented. Love, trust, promises, family at its best. And sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money at all. Sometimes it's knowing that someone believed in you enough to protect your future. Long before you knew you would need protecting. That is the story of how I kept a promise. And every morning when I step onto that porch and watch the mist rise from Cedar Lake, I remember the people who made it possible, the people who saw the storm before I did, and quietly built the shelter anyway.